Fall 2007, Taos County, New Mexico. A water rights dispute had been locked in federal court for 38 years. The Bureau of Land Management, GIS, engineer, satellite data, LIDAR, topography, aerial photography, back to 1935, had built the most advanced geospatial analysis in the region's history, and it still could not answer the court's most critical question: who was using this water before the cameras existed? Then Joseph Mirabal, 71-year-old keeper of Taos Pueblo, opened a cedar box that had never left the community's custody. Inside was a leather map, hand-drawn in 1742, accurate to 40 meters, documenting every water point on every stream, 265 years of unbroken records. The GIS engineer took one look and said, "This changes everything." The map had been folded the same way for 265 years. Joseph Mirabal knew this because his grandfather had told him, and his grandfather's grandfather had told him, and the knowledge of how the leather was creased, 7 precise folds that reduced it from the size of a kitchen table to something that fit inside a cedar box, no larger than a bread box, was itself a form of information, the same way that everything about the map was a form of information. The fold lines were worn soft at their edges. The leather had darkened at the corners where generations of hands had lifted it. At the center, where the main fold crossed the secondary fold, the surface carried a slight depression from the accumulated pressure of all those closings, all those openings, all those moments of consultation over 2.5 centuries of Pueblo life in the Taos Valley. Joseph was 71 years old in the autumn of 2007, and he had been the keeper of the maps for 19 years, since his own elder, a man named Eliseo Lujan, had passed the responsibility to him with a ceremony that lasted 3 days and involved obligations Joseph had never discussed with anyone outside the Pueblo. The maps, there were 7 in total, the oldest dating to approximately 1742, the most recent to 1887, were not stored in any archive or government repository. They were in the cedar box in Joseph's home, along with 3 leather-bound notebooks containing Tiwa language annotations that cross-referenced the maps with seasonal water use records, grazing boundary observations, and notations about specific landscape features that had served as legal reference points in disputes going back to the Spanish colonial period. On a Tuesday morning in late September 2007, Joseph received a visit from a man he had not met before, a tall, carefully dressed man in his late 30s who introduced himself as Andrew Bell, a GIS engineer from the Bureau of Land Management's Taos field office. Andrew had driven up from Santa Fe the previous evening and was staying at a motel on Paseo del Pueblo Sur. He had a laptop bag over one shoulder, a rolled tube that presumably contained printed map materials, and the particular demeanor of a technically confident person who was, Joseph assessed in the first 30 seconds of their introduction, somewhat uncertain about the social dynamics of the meeting he had requested. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Andrew said, at the door of the Pueblo's administrative building, where Joseph had agreed to meet him. "Come in," Joseph said. What had brought Andrew Bell to Taos Pueblo in September 2007 was the Abeyta adjudication, a water rights case that had been working its way through the federal court system since 1969, when the state of New Mexico filed suit to adjudicate surface water rights throughout the Rio Pueblo de Taos and Rio Hondo stream systems. The case was formally titled State of New Mexico v. Abeyta, and it had accumulated, in 38 years of litigation, negotiation, and procedural maneuvering, the kind of documentary complexity that required a dedicated team of attorneys, hydrologists, historians, and technical specialists simply to track. By 2007, the parties to the adjudication included Taos Pueblo, the state of New Mexico, the Taos Valley Acequia Association, which represented 55 acequias and community ditch associations serving approximately 7,000 individual irrigators, the town of Taos, several water and sanitation districts, and numerous mutual domestic water consumer associations, collectively representing another 11,000 valley residents. At the center of the dispute, beneath all the procedural complexity and all the competing legal frameworks, was a question that could be stated simply: who had the right to use how much water from which streams, and when, and under what conditions, and based on what historical record of use? For most of the adjudications parties, this question could be addressed through hydrological surveys, water measurement records, and the state engineer's comprehensive documentation of post-territorial water use. New Mexico water law operated on the prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right, and for non-Indian water users, the documentary record of when water use had begun and how much had been consistently used could generally be assembled from property records, acequia administration logs, and the state engineer's own files. For Taos Pueblo, the question was categorically different. Federal law recognized that Pueblo Indian water rights, sometimes called Pueblo water rights or Winter's Doctrine rights, were not bounded by the prior appropriation system. They derived from the Pueblo's aboriginal occupation of the land and its historical patterns of water use, and they were, in principle, senior to virtually every other water right in the valley, because the Pueblo had been using these waters for centuries before the prior appropriation system was even a concept. But the practical problem, in 2007, was documentation. How do you prove the historical extent of water use that predates systematic record-keeping by European institutions? How do you demonstrate to a federal court that a specific spring had been diverted for irrigation purposes in 1742, or that a particular acequia intake point on the Rio Lucero had been in continuous use since before New Mexico was a territory, a state, or even a concept in American political geography? This was what Andrew Bell's GIS system could not answer. And this was what had brought him, with his laptop and his rolled maps and his professional uncertainty, to Joseph Mirabal's door. Andrew had been assigned to the Taos Adjudications Technical Support Team 18 months earlier, and in that time he had built what was, by the standards of 2007, a sophisticated geospatial analysis of the Taos Valley's surface water systems. His GIS database integrated satellite imagery, LIDAR topographic data, historical aerial photography, going back to 1935, the state engineer's hydrographic survey data, and the BLM's own cadastral mapping records. He could show, with considerable precision, where every major and minor stream channel in the valley ran, where acequia intakes were currently located, where historical diversion structures appeared in the 1935 aerial photographs, and where modern water use patterns diverged from those historical configurations. What he could not show, what the GIS system, for all its technical sophistication, had no capacity to recover, was the period before 1935, before aerial photography, before systematic survey, before any European institutional record-keeping that could be translated into geospatial data. There was an information void in Andrew's system that corresponded precisely to the period when Taos Pueblo's water rights claims were at their strongest and their documentation was most essential. The BLM's historians had located Spanish colonial land grant documents referencing acequia construction in the Taos Valley as early as the mid-18th century. The state engineer's hydrographic survey team had identified physical evidence, earthwork remnants, stone diversion features, ancient channel alignments that suggested water use substantially predating the territorial period. But physical evidence in the landscape without historical documentation of the specific water use it supported was legally insufficient for the adjudication. What the court needed, what the settlement negotiators needed, what every party to the Abeyta case needed in order to move past 38 years of unresolved litigation, was a documented historical record of where, when, and by whom specific water sources had been used. Andrew had heard, through the network of technical specialists working on the adjudication, that Taos Pueblo possessed historical maps. He had asked, through the appropriate channels, whether those maps might be relevant to the GIS analysis he was building. He had been told, politely but without commitment, that the maps existed and that a conversation with the Pueblo's leadership might be appropriate. He had requested the meeting through the Pueblo's tribal administrator, and after 3 weeks of scheduling, he was sitting across a table from Joseph Mirabal, in a room that smelled of cedar and old paper. "I appreciate you meeting with me," Andrew said again, opening his laptop. "I want to be straightforward with you about why I am here. We have a GIS system that documents water use in the Taos Valley from 1935 forward with good confidence. Before 1935, we have almost nothing that is documentarily usable in the adjudication. I understand that the Pueblo has historical maps that may cover that period." Joseph looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, the Taos Mountains were beginning to show their autumn color, the aspen stands on the upper slopes already yellowing, the willows along the Rio Pueblo de Taos still carrying their summer green, but beginning at the edges of the leaves to hint at what was coming. Joseph had spent 71 years watching those mountains and those riverbanks, and he could read them the way Andrew read satellite images, with a precision that came not from instruments, but from accumulated observation across a lifetime measured in seasons rather than years. "I have maps," Joseph said. "They are not the kind of maps your system uses." "What kind are they?" Joseph stood. "I will show you." He led Andrew through a corridor and into a smaller room that served as the Pueblo's historical record space, not a formal archive. Nothing like the climate-controlled facilities Andrew was accustomed to at federal repositories, but a clean, carefully maintained room with cedar-lined walls and shelving that held a combination of modern files and objects of considerable age. From a cabinet behind the main table, Joseph removed the cedar box. He set it on the table, opened it, and with hands that moved with the practiced care of long familiarity, unfolded the oldest map. It covered most of the table when fully opened, a sheet of prepared leather, thin and supple. The surface, covered in markings, made with what appeared to be multiple inks of different ages, and a pigment that Joseph would later explain, was derived from local mineral deposits. The oldest markings, those that formed the primary map structure, had the deep brown tones of ink that had been curing for more than 2 centuries. Later annotations, added over the decades and generations by the map's successive keepers, were in slightly different tones, each successive layer of notation representing a different hand, a different period, a different set of observations about the land and water it recorded. Andrew leaned forward. His first response was professional and analytical, the cartographer's instinct to orient, to identify reference points, to understand the map's coordinate system and scale. What he found, in the first 30 seconds of examination, was surprising. The map was not aligned to magnetic north, as European cartographic conventions would have required, but to a landmark-based orientation system centered on the Taos mountain peak that the Pueblo called Taos Te, a sacred site that served as the geographic reference point for the entire valley mapping tradition. Once Andrew identified this orientation, the map's spatial logic became readable, and what he read astonished him. The stream channels were precise. Not approximate, precise, in the sense that when Andrew compared the hand-drawn channels on the leather map with his GIS-generated stream network, the correspondence was measurable in tens of meters rather than hundreds. The Pueblo's 18th-century cartographers had achieved, through direct observation and accumulated measurement, a spatial accuracy that would have been technically impressive even in the era of theodolites and survey chains, let alone at a time when the mapping was done with nothing more than accumulated knowledge of the land walked season by season, year after year, for generations. But what riveted Andrew's attention most completely was not the stream channels, it was the water points. Along every major stream, the Rio Lucero, the Rio Pueblo de Taos, the Rio Hondo, the smaller arroyos that fed them, the map carried small symbols, each accompanied by Tiwa language notations in the cramped, careful script of whoever had added that particular annotation. The symbols were consistent across the map, indicating that they represented a standardized system, diversion points, intake locations, places where water was formally drawn from the stream channel for irrigation, for domestic use, for livestock. Joseph explained, as Andrew studied the map, that each notation indicated not only the location of the water point, but the season of its use, the type of use, the communities that held the right to use it, and in many cases the approximate date of its establishment, recorded not in European calendar years, but in a dating system based on Pueblo ceremonial cycles that Joseph could translate, approximately, into Western dates. This notation here, Joseph said, placing one finger beside a symbol on the Rio Lucero, indicates a diversion point. The annotation says, "It was established in the time of the third governor after the Reconquest." He paused. That would be approximately 1712 to 1720. Andrew looked at the symbol. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up his GIS map of the Rio Lucero. He oriented the two maps, the laptop screen and the leather surface, and found the corresponding location. His GIS data showed a modern diversion structure at that location, currently in use by one of the Taos Valley Acequia Association's member acequias. The diversion was documented in the state engineer's records from 1923, the earliest documentation Andrew had for that location. The Pueblo's leather map showed the same point, with a notation indicating continuous use from approximately 300 years earlier. How many of these water points are documented on the maps? Andrew asked. Joseph considered. Across all 7 maps, there are 143 water points documented. 47 of those have notations, indicating establishment before 1800. Andrew was quiet for a moment. His GIS database, which represented 3 years of intensive data collection and the most sophisticated geospatial analysis the BLM had applied to the Taos adjudication, documented water use back to 1935 for most locations, and, in a handful of cases, to Spanish colonial records that referenced specific features without precise location data. The leather maps before him documented the same landscape at the same locations, with greater temporal depth and greater spatial precision than anything in his digital system. He sat back and looked at the maps for a long time. Then he looked at Joseph. "Why have not these been submitted to the adjudication court before?" he asked. Joseph's expression was neutral, but not unkind. "Because no one asked," he said. "And because we were not certain the court would accept them." "What made you uncertain?" "The court understands documents in English, written on paper, dated by European calendar systems, produced by institutions. The court recognizes. These maps are in Tiwa. They are on leather. They are dated by a system the court has never seen, and they were made by Pueblo people, not by Spanish administrators or American surveyors." He paused. "We have had the experience, in this valley, of presenting evidence that was real and true and was not accepted because it did not look like evidence the court expected to see." Andrew understood what Joseph was saying. The Abeyta adjudication had been running for 38 years, in part because the fundamental evidentiary challenge, proving historical water use in a legal system built around European-style documentation, had never been adequately resolved. The Pueblo's attorneys had submitted historical evidence in the form of Spanish colonial records, missionary accounts, and anthropological testimony, but these were all mediated through non-Pueblo sources. The maps in front of Andrew were primary sources of a different order, direct records of water use maintained by the water-using community itself, in continuous institutional custody, unmediated by any external authority. "I would like to propose something," Andrew said carefully. "I think these maps should be examined by a qualified historical cartographer and a hydrologist. I think the water points they document should be systematically compared with the GIS data and with the physical landscape, to verify the spatial accuracy and to establish the correspondence between what the maps show and what is on the ground. If that correspondence is as strong as it appears from this initial examination, it would create a powerful evidentiary foundation for the Pueblo's claims. Joseph looked at him steadily. "And what happens to the maps when the adjudication is over?" Andrew met his gaze. "That is entirely your decision." The process of evaluating the Pueblo's leather maps took 11 months, from October 2007 through August 2008. The team that Joseph agreed to work with, after extensive consultation within the Pueblo's Leadership Council and with the Pueblo's legal team, included a historical cartographer from the University of New Mexico, a hydrologist from the Bureau of Reclamation's Albuquerque area office, and a specialist in Tiwa language and Pueblo historical documentation from the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque. Andrew Bell participated as the GIS technical specialist, responsible for translating the map data into the coordinate systems that the adjudication court used. The first phase of the work was purely cartographic, establishing the spatial accuracy of the maps by comparing their landmark positions, stream channels, and water points with current GIS data and satellite imagery. The historical cartographer, Dr. Elena Reyes, had worked with indigenous mapping traditions from several Southwest cultures, and she brought to the analysis a methodological framework that treated the maps not as failed approximations of European cartographic norms, but as coherent spatial records operating within their own consistent reference system. What Dr. Reyes found, when she completed her spatial analysis, was that the maps were accurate to within 40 meters at 91% of reference points, a spatial precision that exceeded many professional surveys conducted in the region before the advent of electronic surveying equipment in the 1970s. The stream channel alignments matched current GIS data with an average deviation of 23 meters, within the range of measurement error attributable to natural channel migration over 2.5 centuries. The water points, cross-referenced with their Tiwa annotations and with the physical landscape, showed 97% correspondence with identifiable physical features, existing diversion structures, bedrock formations, stream confluences, spring locations. The Tiwa language specialist, a scholar named Dr. Maria Archuleta who had been working with Taos Pueblo elders on language documentation projects for 12 years, spent 4 months working with Joseph to translate and contextualize the annotations. What emerged from this process was a chronological record of water use that, when mapped onto the European calendar using the cross-references available in Joseph's Cedar box notebooks, extended backward in documented, notated, institution-maintained form to 1742, with strong linguistic and notational evidence, suggesting that the mapping tradition itself was considerably older, and that the 1742 date represented the earliest surviving physical artifact rather than the beginning of the time. Practice. The hydrologist, Dr. Robert Nakamura, from the Bureau of Reclamation, took the water points documented in the leather maps and analyzed them against the physical evidence in the landscape, the remnants of earthwork diversions, the patterns of stream bank erosion and deposition, the distribution of agricultural soils in the valley, to assess whether the historical patterns of use the maps described were consistent with what the physical landscape showed. His analysis confirmed, at 41 of the 47 pre-1800 water points, physical evidence of long-term diversion infrastructure that was consistent with the periods of use the maps documented. Andrew Bell ran the GIS analysis that integrated all of this into the spatial framework the court could use. He created a layered dataset in which each of the 143 water points from the leather maps was geo-referenced with coordinates, annotated with the temporal data from the Tiwa notations, and cross-referenced with Dr. Nakamura's physical evidence findings and the BLM's existing hydrographic survey data. The resulting dataset showed, in the visual language of modern GIS, is a 265-year record of continuous, documented water use across the Rio Pueblo de Taos and Rio Hondo stream systems. The deepest historical water use record for any party to the Abeyta adjudication by a margin of more than a century. In October 2008, Joseph presented the maps to a session of the adjudication court, accompanied by a 57-page technical report, prepared jointly by Dr. Reyes, Dr. Archuleta, Dr. Nakamura, and Andrew Bell. The court session was unusual in several respects. Federal courts that handle water rights adjudications are accustomed to reviewing maps. They handle enormous quantities of cartographic evidence, but the evidence being presented that day was unlike anything the court had received in 39 years of the Abeyta case. The presiding judge, reviewing the leather maps alongside the GIS dataset and the technical report, asked Joseph a series of questions that Joseph answered through a combination of direct testimony and reference to specific notations in the maps. At one point, the judge held one of the smaller maps, a detailed rendering of the Rio Lucero drainage, dated by the Tiwa notations to the mid-18th century, and looked at it for an extended moment. Then he asked Joseph, "Mr. Mirabal, how do you know these maps accurately represent the land as it was when they were made?" Joseph considered the question. "Because the people who made them lived on that land and depended on that water for their lives," he said. "A map that was wrong would have caused fields to go unirrigated, livestock to go unwatered, crops to fail. The map was corrected every generation by the people using it, because a wrong map was dangerous. A wrong map meant people suffered." He paused. "Your maps are accurate because your instruments are precise. Our maps are accurate because our lives required them to be." The judge wrote something in his notes. The technical report was admitted as evidence on November 12, 2008. The leather maps themselves, authenticated by Dr. Ray's cartographic analysis, and accepted as primary historical documents under the standards applicable to Indigenous historical records in federal proceedings, were admitted as exhibits on the same date. This admission, the acceptance of Indigenous-made, Tiwa language, leather surface maps as formal legal evidence in a federal water rights adjudication, was, as the Pueblo's legal team noted in subsequent communications, without direct precedent in New Mexico water law. The evidentiary impact of the maps on the Abeyta adjudication was significant but not immediate. Water rights litigation moves at the pace of institutional process, and the Abeyta case had been moving at that pace for 4 decades. What the maps contributed, in the years between their admission as evidence in 2008 and the eventual passage of the Taos Pueblo Indian Water Rights Settlement Act by Congress in November 2010, and its signing into law on December 8, 2010, was a factual foundation for the Pueblo's historical claims that had not existed in documentable form before. The Settlement Act, as ultimately negotiated and enacted, confirmed Taos Pueblo's right to irrigate 5,712.78 historically irrigated acres. The historically irrigated acreage figure that appeared in the settlement agreement derived partly from the hydrographic survey and partly from the historical record of use documented in the leather maps. The Pueblo's surface water consumption right was confirmed at the amount needed to irrigate that acreage, with the Pueblo agreeing to limit active irrigation to 2,322 acres currently under cultivation. The act also confirmed the Pueblo's groundwater rights, provided approximately 12,000 acre-feet per year of total water rights, and allocated $66 million in immediate federal funding, along with authorization for an additional $58 million for water development and conservation infrastructure. The settlement resolved not only the Pueblo's claims but the competing claims of the Taos Valley Acequia Associations, 55-member acequias, the town of Taos, and the 11 mutual domestic water consumer associations, a resolution that the presiding judge, at the settlement's signing ceremony in Taos in May 2006, described as the most comprehensive water rights agreement in New Mexico history. Andrew Bell attended the signing ceremony. He stood at the back of the room and watched Joseph Mirabal sign the settlement document with the same deliberate, measured quality that characterized everything Joseph did. Every movement carrying the awareness that it was being witnessed and that what was being witnessed mattered. Afterward, Andrew found him in the reception area and extended his hand. "Congratulations," Andrew said. Joseph shook his hand. "Thank you for taking the maps seriously." Andrew thought about how to answer that. What he wanted to say was that the maps had taken themselves seriously, that their accuracy and their depth were self-evident once anyone with the right technical background examined them. What he said was, they earned it. In the months following the settlement signing, Andrew proposed to the BLM's Taos field office, as a formal collaboration with Taos Pueblo, to digitize the complete set of 7 maps and their associated Tiwa language notebooks. The proposal moved through the BLM's bureaucratic process slowly, but without obstruction. The agency had, in recent years, been developing protocols for collaborative work with tribal nations on cultural resource documentation, and the Taos map digitization fit within frameworks that already existed. Joseph and the Pueblo's Leadership Council deliberated on the proposal at length. The question of digitization, of translating the leather maps into a format that could be stored, replicated, and accessed through computer systems, raised issues that were not primarily technical. The maps were not simply geographic records. They were living institutional documents, maintained within a specific cultural context, accessible within the Pueblo through protocols that governed who could see them, when, and for what purpose. Digitization would create copies that existed outside those protocols, in systems controlled by the federal government, potentially accessible to anyone with database access. The Council's decision, reached after 3 months of deliberation, was conditional acceptance. The digitization would proceed. With specific restrictions, the digital files would be stored in a jointly managed repository, with access requiring approval from both the BLM and the Pueblo's Leadership Council. Specific annotations that the Pueblo identified as sensitive, references to sacred sites, ceremonial water uses, and landscape features of spiritual significance, would be documented, but encrypted within the digital files in a manner that allowed the Pueblo to choose, case by case, what to share with outside parties. The physical maps would remain in the cedar box in Joseph's care, and in the care of whoever succeeded him as keeper. The digitization project ran from 2011 through 2014, with Dr. Reyes and her UNM team handling the technical imaging work, and Dr. Archuleta leading the transcription and translation of the Tiwa language annotations. Andrew Bell built the GIS integration layer that connected the digitized maps to the BLM's existing spatial data infrastructure, while maintaining the access controls the Pueblo had specified. The resulting digital archive, 7 maps, 3 notebooks, 143 water points, and 47 sets of pre-1800 historical water use documentation, was formally transferred to joint custody in a ceremony at Taos Pueblo in October 2014. At that ceremony, held in the same administrative building where Joseph and Andrew had first met 7 years earlier, Joseph spoke briefly about what the maps represented. He spoke in Tiwa first, for the elders and community members who were present, and then in English for the BLM officials and university representatives who had participated in the project. "The ancestor who first drew on this leather," he said, holding the oldest map, "did not know about GIS. They did not know about satellites or computers or federal water law. What they knew was this valley, this water, this land. They recorded what they knew in the only way they knew how to record it. Accurately, carefully, with the understanding that people who came after them would need to know what they knew." He paused. "That is what a map is. It is knowledge from the past given to the future. The format changes. The knowledge does not." He looked at Andrew Bell, who was standing at the side of the room. Andrew nodded. The collaborative project between Taos Pueblo and the BLM generated, in the years that followed, a documentary record that extended well beyond its original purpose. The technical methodology, developed by Dr. Reyes and Andrew's team, for integrating indigenous cartographic traditions with GIS systems while maintaining community control over sensitive data, became a reference model for similar projects involving indigenous mapping in the American Southwest and beyond. In 2016, the BLM's National Science and Technology Center published a technical guidance document drawing on the Taos project, establishing protocols for collaborative indigenous mapping projects across the agency's national portfolio. The document cited the Taos leather maps as the primary case study for the evidentiary value of community-maintained indigenous cartographic records in federal land management proceedings. By 2019, 14 additional Pueblo communities in New Mexico had initiated similar documentation projects. Using the Taos methodology as a template, and in several cases involving Dr. Reyes or members of her UNM research team, the Navajo Nation's Historic Preservation Office began a comparable project covering traditional land use mapping across a much larger geographic area. The methodology spread to indigenous communities in Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, each adaptation shaped by the specific cartographic traditions and cultural protocols of the communities involved, but sharing the fundamental approach of treating indigenous maps as primary sources, deserving the same evidentiary weight as any other form of historical documentation. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, had been tracking the intersection of indigenous traditional knowledge and modern geographic information systems since the early 2000s, as part of its broader work on intangible cultural heritage and indigenous peoples' rights. The Taos Pueblo project and the body of collaborative indigenous mapping work it had helped to catalyze across the American Southwest came to UNESCO's attention through reports submitted by the United States to the Intergovernmental Committee for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. In 2023, UNESCO's Indigenous Peoples and Knowledge Systems program included the Pueblo mapping tradition, along with the collaborative digitization methodology developed from the Taos project, in a flagship publication highlighting indigenous knowledge systems and UNESCO-designated sites. The following year, in 2024, UNESCO formally recognized the tradition of indigenous cartographic knowledge maintenance in the American Pueblo communities as a form of intangible cultural heritage, warranting international documentation and safeguarding support, the first time a specifically cartographic traditional knowledge practice had received this designation. Joseph Mirabal was 78 years old by then, and he had already begun the process of selecting and preparing his successor as keeper of the maps, a younger man from the Pueblo named Santiago Vigil, who was 34 and had participated in the digitization project as a student assistant and had demonstrated the quality of attention that the role required. Joseph was teaching Santiago the way Alicio Lujan had taught him, and the way the knowledge had always been transmitted, not through formal instruction in isolation, but through shared practice across seasons, through the gradual transfer of responsibility that allowed the keeper's knowledge to settle into the successor, the way water settles into a landscape, finding its level, following the contours, becoming part of the place. Andrew Bell had left the BLM's Taos field office in 2013 and moved to a position with the New Mexico Office of the State Engineer, where he worked on water rights, adjudication support across the state. He and Joseph had stayed in occasional contact. The professional relationship that had begun with the 2007 meeting had evolved, over the years, into something more personal. The respectful connection between two people who had looked at the same landscape through very different instruments and discovered, in the process, that both instruments had something the other lacked. Andrew called Joseph in the autumn of 2024 After he read the UNESCO announcement, the call was brief. Joseph was not a person who expanded conversations unnecessarily, but warm in the way their communications had become warm over 17 years. "I saw the announcement," Andrew said. "Yes," Joseph said. "It is deserved." "The maps were always what they were," Joseph said. "The recognition is new. The maps are not." Andrew understood this precisely. He had spent his career working with geospatial data, building systems that translated the physical world into digital representations that could be analyzed, shared, and acted upon. He believed in the power of those systems. He had also spent 17 years understanding that the physical world contained information that his systems had not been built to hold, the knowledge of seasonal water behavior accumulated by a community across 3 centuries, the spatial memory of a landscape encoded in the hand of a cartographer who had never heard of coordinate systems, but whose map was accurate to 40 meters. The institutional continuity that had maintained a Cedar box's contents through Spanish colonial rule, Mexican governance, American territorial administration, statehood, and 39 years of federal water litigation without losing a single fold. His GES database covered 72 years of the Taos Valley's water landscape with excellent precision. The leather maps in Joseph's care covered 265 years of the same landscape, with comparable precision and considerably more depth of contextual understanding. He had learned, from that comparison, something that his training had not prepared him to learn, that the oldest data is sometimes the most irreplaceable, and that the systems built to preserve knowledge are only as durable as the communities that maintain them. Santiago Vigil took formal custody of the Cedar box in a ceremony held on a Tuesday morning in October 2025, in the same room where the box had been kept for as long as anyone could document. The ceremony lasted 3 days. Joseph was present for all of it, as Eliseo Lujan had been present when Joseph received the responsibility 19 years before. Most of what happened in those 3 days was not recorded in any format, not in writing, not digitally, not in any repository outside the memory of the people who were there. This was intentional. Some knowledge does not travel well in translation, and the knowledge of how to be the keeper of the maps was knowledge that had always traveled the way the Pueblo's deepest knowledge traveled, person to person, across time, through direct transmission that required presence and relationship and years of preparation. What Santiago received, in the Cedar box, was everything his predecessors had received: 7 maps on leather, 3 notebooks in Tiwa, and the accumulated understanding of how to read them, how to maintain them, and how to know when to show them to the world and when to keep them close. He also received, from the Joint Custody Repository in the BLM's secure digital archive and the Pueblo's own server, access to the digital versions, the geo-referenced, GIS integrated, high-resolution scans that Andrew Bell's team had spent 3 years creating. These were tools that would not have been available to any previous keeper, and Santiago had spent 2 years of his preparation, learning to use them with the same facility with which he was learning to unfold the leather originals. The day after the ceremony, Santiago walked the Rio Lucero. He walked it the way the keepers had always walked it, on foot, in the morning, paying attention to the water level and the bank conditions and the behavior of the current at each of the diversion points his predecessor had shown him. At the diversion point whose Tiwa notation indicated establishment in the time of the 3rd governor after the Reconquest, the point that Andrew Bell's GIS data had confirmed was in continuous use from approximately 1712 to 2024. Santiago stopped and looked at the water for a long time. The water was cold and clear from the mountain, snowmelt, and it moved at the pace that October water moved, in this valley, unhurried and purposeful. Santiago looked at it the way Joseph had taught him to look at it, not as a resource to be measured and allocated, but as a relationship to be maintained across time, by people who understood that the water had been here before them and would be here after them, and that their responsibility was to be, for their generation, the reliable link in the chain of stewardship that connected the past to the future. He took out a small notebook, a modern one, spiral-bound, with lined paper, and made a notation in Tiwa. The notation described the water level, the condition of the diversion headworks, the weather, and the date, recorded in both the Western calendar and the Pueblo ceremonial dating system that the maps had always used. He would transfer the notation to the leather notebooks later, in the careful hand he had been practicing for 2 years, adding one more layer of annotation to documents that already held 3 centuries of accumulated observation. He closed the notebook, put it in his jacket pocket, and continued along the river. The water moved beside him, indifferent to who was watching, and completely dependent on whether anyone was watching, which was, as Joseph had explained to him, and as Joseph's teachers had explained before that, exactly the nature of the responsibility the cedar box carried. The land and the water did not record themselves. They required people who remembered. Santiago Vigil remembered. The maps remembered with him.